Hi, everybody. This is Blaine DeSantis, and I welcome you to another edition of Books and Looks. Yes, this is our weekly voyage of discovery in the wonderful world of books. Books that I've read and authors that I've interviewed. And today we are talking about the subject of reading. That's right, reading and how America is failing abysmally in reading. We have with us Irene Daria. Irene has written a spectacular book. It's called I Didn't Believe Him. True story based on her son, Eric, and the fact that Eric came home one day and said, Mommy, why aren't they teaching me how to read? This is in kindergarten. And she basically brushed him aside. But things didn't get better. It got a little bit worse. And by the time he was in the first grade, they said he was learning disabled because he couldn't read. What happened? Why weren't they teaching him how to read? Or more to the point, how are they teaching him how to read? Some cockamamie thing called balanced literacy, which you'll hear all about. It is a wonderful story, though, of how Irene has gotten in here, changed her degrees to get helping with kids reading. She's got her own workbook. She's got everything. Her son, who was supposedly learning disabled, by the time he was 17, was a paid intern for Apple. Yeah, doing stuff that I don't even know. I can't even describe it. But he's an amazing kid, smart kid, supposedly couldn't read. They weren't teaching him how to read proper way. And we're going to learn all about reading. And it's fascinating, okay? It's not boring. It's fascinating, the bad job we're doing here, teaching our kids how to read here in America. And it's just such a shame. And so we want to sit there and really pay attention to Irene Daria and her new book, I Didn't Believe Him. Let's go right to that interview. Welcome to Books and Looks.
Thank you, Blaine. Very happy to be here.
Well, I read this book in an instant. It is an eye-opener. It is a spectacular book, and you have done a great job educating all us about reading, something we don't know enough about. So I'm looking forward to this today. So before we get into the book, let's talk a little bit about you. Where are you from? Where'd you get your degrees? And just tell us how this all developed into the book and everything else.
Sure. So I live in Manhattan and Amagansett, which is a town out on Eastern Long Island. But I'm work-wise, I'm based in Manhattan, and the book takes place in Manhattan. My son went to school in Manhattan. I am a cognitive developmental psychologist. I have a PhD in that. I did my dissertation on how children learn to read because of what happened to my son. I had been a journalist before I became a psychologist, and got my degree because of what happened to him. I own a tutoring company in New York, a K through 12 tutoring company, also because of what happened to my son, and spend my work days seeing how many gaps many children have in their education, and filling those gaps for them. So,
Wow.
a lot of things we can talk about.
Lots going on. But what's interesting is that at the time this all started, which was around 18, 20 years ago, I guess, you weren't intending to go into get the degree which you ended up getting. Is that correct?
Correct. I had worked as a journalist. I was a reporter at Women's Wear Daily and an editor at Harper's Bazaar. And after I had my kids, I became a freelance writer working from home. I did decide, I had done a lot of writing on parenting issues and things having to do with psychology. And I decided to go back to school for a PhD in psychology. But I was on the clinical psychology track. I was going to a school in Manhattan called the New School, where you go for your master's first. Luckily, you don't. It's not like you're committed from the beginning at a PhD program. You go for your master's first, and then you choose which track you want. Do you want the clinical or do you want the cognitive developmental? And I was on the clinical track and doing really well. I was writing a book with the head of the department, getting really great grades, on track to be accepted to the very competitive clinical psych program. And then because of what happened to Eric, and I realized not just what happened to Eric, I learned at the time that millions of children in our country had been falsely labeled learning disabled, when there really was nothing wrong with them. All that was wrong was that their schools were using improper methods to teach reading. And these children, they were teaching kids to read the way struggling readers read. That is still happening in our country. A lot of good news is happening. This method, which we'll get into, has actually been made illegal in 10 states, believe it or not. It is against the law to use this method. But just because it's against the law doesn't mean it isn't still being used. Like jaywalking is against the law, but what happens, right? So many teachers need to be retrained. The teachers of at colleges of education are still teaching teachers to teach in this ineffective method, and parents have no idea. I had no clue. So I learned about this. My son finally got through to me. My son, when he was 5 years old, came home from school and said to me, he was in kindergarten. Now imagine a 5-year-old child saying this. But many of them do realize. He came home from school and said, "Mommy, my school isn't teaching me how to read. They tell us to look at the pictures and guess what the words are. And that's not reading, Mommy. How do you read?" And instead of believing him, that's why the title of my book is I Didn't Believe Him, I told him to trust his school. And I told him to trust his school, even though his school had just held a meeting for parents explaining how they teach reading, because most parents at the school were totally confused by what the school was doing. And at this meeting, they told us, don't have your kids sound out words with you when they read with you. They used 3 main methods of teaching reading: guessing from the picture, using context clues, and using just the first letter of the word. This all sounded really strange to me, but this school was so well regarded. It's actually a public school, but very rigorous, and children apply to get into it. Very hard to get in. And it had a great reputation, great test scores, and I was in awe of the school, and I knew nothing. If there's one message I would love to get across in our interview is I think it's so important for parents to know how children learn to read. It doesn't mean every parent has to be the one to teach their child, but it's so important to know how that process happens and how it should happen. Because one, if you want to do it, it's so easy, and it's actually a lot of fun if you do it correctly from the beginning. And we'll talk about this more, but I've written a series of workbooks that parents can use to teach their kids how to read at home. Just go through the workbook and workbooks, and your kids will be reading. Yeah. But that so anyway, I trusted his school. Kindergarten year for him was a nightmare for all of us, for the whole family, but really for him, my heart now. I wrote the book, honestly. You had asked me before we started recording, was this stressful? I cannot tell you how traumatic this experience was for me. It was traumatic for Eric in kindergarten. But sorry, I'm going a little bit too much all over the place. Let me stay with Eric. He began having nightmares, dreaming he was drowning, saying he hated going to school. He was a really happy, chatty extrovert who moved to the back of the classroom and sat there in silence with his head bowed, hoping the teacher wouldn't notice him. I witnessed this once when I was in the classroom. Terrible, terrible, terrible year for him. And I had no idea. He was bringing home great grades on his report card, great grades in reading. I talked to his teacher about it. Do you see any reason for this stress? She said, no, not. And finally, so a whole year passed that this poor kid had to go to school wanting to learn how to read, not being taught how to read, his mother telling him to trust the school, right? And where was he going to turn for help? So finally in first grade, he comes home and says, now imagine the thought that went into this. This is now a 6-year-old boy, right? He doesn't know the word. Well, I'm spilling the beans a little too soon. He goes, "Mommy, do you want to see how I read? I'll show you how I read." He takes a little book. You remember this scene from the book,
Oh,
right?
yes. Huh?
He holds the book behind his back and turning the pages at just the right time, quote unquote, reads the story. So he goes, a house is a home, turn the page. A teepee is a home, turn the page. An apartment building is a home, turn the page. And that's when I finally realized, oh my God, the reason his school thinks he knows how to read is because he's memorized all of these little books with these little repetitive patterns in them, and he seems to be reading beautifully. And that's when I stepped up to the plate. And
All right. Well, we got a lot to talk about here because reading is so very important. And you begin your book with an amazing introduction talking about the statistics on reading. Tell us a little bit about how poorly we're doing as a country when it comes to reading.
so 2/3 of children in America grow up without knowing how to read well. 2/3. 67% of fourth graders are not proficient in reading. And students who don't read proficiently by the time they enter fourth grade are 4 times as likely to eventually drop out of school. And 2/3 of those who are not proficient will wind up on jail or on welfare. There's a phrase, it's called the I'm not sure if this is it exactly, but something like this, the school to prison pipeline. Reading is such an important factor in why people go down the route that has them end up in prison. They're functionally illiterate. I don't want to say they have no choice, but it's like you become desperate, you become angry. It's a it, 85% of juvenile offenders are functionally illiterate, and 3 out of 5 inmates in American prisons do not know how to read.
Mhm. Yep. No doubt about it. It is a epidemic. It is an epidemic that is growing, unfortunately. And, we have some other fascinating things that are happening because of this. I want to get over here because, you know, and before I get there, I want to go to the end because you just said Eric was considered learning disabled. What's Eric doing now? What happened when he was 17 years old?
So I just want to qualify something very important. Many kids are identified as learning disabled. Many kids have learning issues, and those kids can go on to tremendous success in life. Richard Branson, the head of Virgin Airways, is dyslexic. Whoopi Goldberg, so just because a child is learning disabled doesn't mean that they will not have great success in life. The reason it upset me so much that Eric's school wanted to evaluate him and eventually did classify him as learning disabled, even though an evaluation found nothing wrong with him. That's just criminal. That's just wrong. And the reason they labeled him learning disabled was because his reading level did not match his very high IQ. Now, his reading level did not match his very high IQ because his school failed to teach him how to read, and he was an entire year behind. So you got to think, there many articles have been written. Is it dyslexia or dysteachia? It was clearly dysteachia, yet the school was blaming the child. And if a school sees a child, and this is where a child's trajectory to success and to fulfilling whatever potential they might have can go astray, is if a school considers a child learning disabled, many schools, not all of them, some are remarkable at and well trained in handling this, but in many schools, they will begin to expect less of that child, and children live up to those expectations. And that is why I felt like a train was barreling towards us, where they kept saying something's wrong with him, and I kept saying something's wrong with your teaching. But and this is where, my answer to your question is, had I trusted his school and not had my son not figured out how to get through to me, I would have believed the school that something was wrong with my child and something would have become wrong with my child because the school was teaching reading improperly. He then would not have learned how to read. And this is when children who have quote unquote learning, disabilities fail because the system is not supporting them and is not teaching them and is not bringing them up to their potential. So because, thank God, I figured out, and I wasn't a psychologist. I had no idea how kids learn how to read. I figured it out by Googling, by talking to other parents. The other parents at his school, the vast majority of all of them taught their kids how to read before they started kindergarten, which I didn't know. But where Eric ended up, Eric just soared as a student once he learned how to read. So he was classified as learning disabled when he was in first grade. By second grade, he was declassified because clearly this boy was not learning disabled, and I brought him up to where he needed to be. He was accepted in third grade to the Johns Hopkins University Center for Talented Youth. He won many awards in his elementary school for academics, the same school, that at first was like, oh, there's something wrong with him because, he's not reading. Became salutatorian of his high school, perfect score on the ACT, all fives on every single AP exam he took. When he was 17 years old and just a freshman in college, Apple was holding a recruiting event on his campus, and you needed to be a higher upperclassman to participate. And one thing there was, like in most things in life, sometimes there are silver linings. One thing that this experience with his school taught him. Now, mind you, he never knew his school thought anything was wrong with him. I protected him from that knowledge. My husband and I never even discussed it in the home for fear that the kids might hear this. But he learned that teachers are human. Teachers are sometimes, that there are ways around something, and he, if possible, he should advocate for himself. He should try, right? He should give it a try. So, they said, oh, it's only for upperclassmen. And he was like, okay, but let me go and let me try, because he had this great idea that he wanted to share with Apple. And an opportunity presented itself to speak to the recruiter. He told the recruiter his idea. The recruiter said, that sounds like a great idea. And he had him talk to someone else. And that person said, wow, that's a really good idea. And Apple hired him at the age of 17 in the role of an intern, a paid intern. They flew him to California. They paid for his housing. They paid for him to work there. And he began developing this idea, which is now, it's now out on the Apple's operating system. It's called Live Text. It allows you to use your camera to take a picture of something, and then you can edit the words and have access to the words in that picture. 17 years old, and now he's working in San Francisco as in artificial intelligence, developing autonomous vehicles, having a fabulous career, fabulous success. And none of this would have happened if he had not gotten me to realize his school was not, it's really on him, right? That his school wasn't teaching him how to read. And if I hadn't stepped up to the plate and taught him myself, would have had a whole different trajectory.
You see, friends, this is what I tell you. You have to be proactive. You have to do what you have to do. You have to listen to your kids. You got to help them read. You got to start early. I've got a brother-in-law over in Romania whose son is starting kindergarten this year. And I say to him, I said, Lawrence, are they teaching him how to read? And he's telling us how he teaches to read. What's interesting is the little boy not only reads and speaks in Romanian, he reads and speaks in English. So he's getting it both ways, but he's learning how to read, and that's great. We want to do that. But you see, friends, became intern with Apple at 17. But at fifth, when he was 5, when he was 6, learning disabled. Give me a break. Give me a break. Now, I want to get into that whole thing because that's important. I think it's called balanced literacy. Is that what we're talking about? Is that how they call it now? What explain to us? If we
Yes.
could just shortly, what is balanced literacy? What does it mean? I don't get it.
So I'm going to give you an abbreviation. So the teaching of reading in our country has been done incorrectly in many schools. We're a big country, right, with a lot of different schools, and some schools are doing a great job. But in a lot of schools, the teaching of reading went wrong in the 1920s. That's when the progressive movement happened. There was a lot of change in our country, and phonics got booted out of schools. And a method called look say was placed into schools. That's that used the Dick and Jane readers. And that method, believe it or not, didn't even tell kids that the alphabet existed. They wanted kids to memorize words as whole units. There was a theory of psychology called Gestalt psychology that at the time believed that's how we processed information, as whole units. That was disproven, but no one told the educators, right? So they kept on teaching in this whole word method. And a man named Samuel Orton, who created the Orton-Gillingham method of teaching, that's the gold standard today for teaching dyslexic kids how to read, and really for teaching any child how to read, um, lived in the 1920s, and he was working in the schools in the Midwest that were using this new whole word curriculum. And he saw that. Now, before that, everybody learned to read beautifully. Everyone who was taught learned how to read, unless there was a genuine neurological serious issue, right? The letters that Civil War soldiers wrote home are among the most literate ever written. Um, but all of a sudden, in the 1920s, all these children were struggling to learn how to read. And Samuel Orton wrote an article that was published called The Sight Word Method of Teaching Reading as a Source of Learning Disability. And he said this method is causing kids to become dyslexic, ignored. So fast forward, because we don't have a lot of time. This method was in schools until the 1950s, when a book called Why Johnny Can't Read came out. An immediate bestseller, made parents aware of the fact that kids were not being taught how to sound out words. A big uproar happened, and phonics came back into the schools very briefly because at that time, a man named Ken Goodman published a paper in the 1960s, um, reporting on a study he had done, a quote unquote study, one little study, right? He observed children as they read text that was above their grade level read. Now, and he saw that these children used three methods. They guessed what the words could be from the picture. Now, this is what balanced literacy teaches. I'm actually answering your question in a long, roundabout way. The children guessed what the words were from the picture. They used context clues to figure out an unfamiliar word, and they used the first letter of the word to try to figure out the word. And they made the most mistakes by using the first letter, which made Ken Goodman then conclude that phonics was the worst method because these children made the most mistakes when they tried to sound out the word. Hard to believe, but this guy who had a PhD, right, and who became the guru of reading education, didn't think to himself, these kids were taught how to read using the look-say method of reading. They never were taught phonics, so they were forced to guess from the picture and use context clues. But he then decreed that this is how we learn to read. He called reading a guessing game, said phonics was not important. And this is then how schools worldwide in American-speaking countries began teaching how to read. And so this was called whole language. And when California implemented whole language, it went from being high up in reading scores to being dead last. Only Guam was lower than California. The US government stepped in because all these reading wars started happening. People were arguing, phonics advocates wanted phonics, whole word advocates wanted whole word. And the government said, okay, these are belief systems that are clashing, and they're going to clash forever until we have solid evidence of what works. And the government convened something called the National Reading Panel to review hundreds and thousands of studies um, on, sorry, 100,000, more than 100,000 studies on how children learn to read. And the evidence was conclusive. There were 5 things that were necessary, and phonics was one of them. Without phonics, your engine isn't going to start. You're not going to be able to apply vocabulary or comprehend or anything else, right? Okay, this big study came out. Once again, parents, you have more power than you realize, right? In the 50s, parents complained. Now in the year 2000, parents complained, and they wanted phonics. That's when balanced literacy entered the picture. Whole language actually did not disappear from the classrooms. It renamed itself, it rebranded itself balanced literacy. And they said, we will give you the best of both worlds. We will give you big, meaningful books that the whole language method wanted kids to be learning from. And we will give you phonics. And they did. A lot of parents think, oh, they lied. They didn't teach phonics. And I thought that at the beginning too. But what they did was they sprinkled it in just sort of on an as needed basis. So parents often, they would realize their kids couldn't read a word like cane. And so they would go to the teacher and say, my child doesn't know the silent E rule. And the teacher's response would be, well, your child was absent the day I taught that lesson. One day. I mean, and some kids, everything in human, uh, in us, in the human species, with abilities fall on a continuum, right? Some people are extreme at one extreme, some people are at another extreme, and most people are in the middle for lots of different things. And the same is true for reading. And some kids, must have explicit systematic phonics in very high doses. Other kids will intuit how to read and just pick it up. I mean, that does happen. But most kids need, both. But so balanced literacy continued to balanced literacy is, because it's based on whole language, believed children learn how to read by being read to, and that it's a natural process, like learning to speak. When we were babies and we were learning to speak, no one ever drilled us on sounds or had us fill out worksheets. We just learned to talk. And balanced literacy believed that that's what would happen with kids. And very sadly, they were wrong.
Yep, they were. And for many, many years, they were wrong. And like you said, they're still being taught. Much of that same type of reading is still being taught. And, friends, we said it doesn't matter where you go to school. It's a high-end school that Irene had her children in. My kids were in school, in good schools. You can go to public school, private schools. It's anywhere. They all got indoctrinated into one way of teaching. And some of the teachers are actually realizing, oh, my God, I never did learn how to teach these kids how to read. And it's a nightmare. It's an epidemic. And we go down and down. Now, one of the things that I love is as part of this is while they don't want to promote necessary phonics in reading, they will promote phonics in spelling. For instance, if you have the word of, okay, we spelled O-F, they will accept U-V, of. Well, then how are you supposed to read it in a book? It's not written that way. Tell us just a little bit about that.
Right. They believed that children, this whole method of teaching is something that's known as the progressive method of teaching. And the difference, there's progressive and there's traditional. And in the tradition, let me start with the traditional classroom, because that's what most parents are the most familiar with. In a traditional classroom, you have a teacher standing at the front of the room teaching the children. And they're all expected to learn the same body of knowledge, and they will be quizzed or tested on this knowledge. In a progressive classroom, it's believed children learn through discovery, and that they learn best through discovery. So in a traditional classroom, a teacher is considered a sage on a stage. In a progressive classroom, a teacher is considered a guide on the side. and guides children towards knowledge. And kids will do a lot of projects and they'll leave the classroom with a lot of different knowledge based on what their projects were on and all that. So falling within that context, the belief was children discover spelling as they are spelling. So the first, of, that's how they hear it, v, and that's how they write it. So again, in balanced literacy classrooms, they say, oh, we do phonics. They did this method called invented spelling, which now, as I mentioned, I have a K through 12 tutoring company. I mean, you can imagine the kids who learned to spell in this way, their spelling is abysmal, because they never learned the real phonics rules and they just pieced together how they thought the spelling happened, and the teachers accepted it because they thought that um, it would interfere with the child's joy. I actually had a parent say to me the other day, she said she asked the teacher, "Do you correct their homework?" And she said, "No, I don't want to get them upset." Like, well, getting things wrong, you need to develop resilience in children, and you need to develop, sometimes you get
Yes.
things wrong and then you work and you get it right, and not just like, oh, everything's lovely even though it's all wrong. So, yeah.
Yep. No doubt about it. It's very fascinating they would do that. Now, one of the things here is you sent Eric to a different school than his brother. Did his
I
brother
did.
have problems reading when he was in that school?
His brother did not have problems. The school that Jamie, my older son, went to, used this. Now, balanced literacy is a method. It's not a it's like a theory. So every school, every teacher, it will be different what's happening in that classroom. And to really know, you have to go into each classroom and see what is that teacher doing. So even though, his first school used balanced literacy, his kindergarten teacher did teach them phonics. She taught them like little word families, words that end in AT, words that end in AN. His school had an after school program called Fun with Phonics, that he went to. And Jamie also is a different style of learner. There's something, we won't have time to get into this sadly, but in the Myers-Briggs system, there's something called sensing and intuiting. A lot of people are familiar with that. In the psychological research, it's called field dependent or independent, or analytical versus big picture. Jamie is more of an intuitive big picture learner who will intuit things, and Eric is more of a sensing analytical learner. And when we look at what he ended up doing for a living, right? Very analytical and sequential and systematic, and he definitely needed the phonics. We sent him to the different school because of how Jamie's school taught math, which is a whole other
Okay. Yeah,
topic.
but that's okay. Well, fine. Well, it's very interesting. Well, now, let me ask this question, and this is philosophical, I guess. Uh, when I went home every day after school, my mom was there, and then my dad come home. He was a lawyer. They read with me. They showed me books. I had books. We don't have that anymore. Do you think the decline of the stay-at-home mom, or the fact that everybody's got 2 or 3 jobs, do you think that's also contributing to our downfall in reading?
No. I really don't. I don't. I wasn't a stay-at-home mom. I was freelancing, and then I started the tutoring company from out of our apartment. So I was working and I taught my son how to read. I think a lot of people, women who work when both spouses work, um most people will be reading to their children at bedtime. I think, what and something that's really important for people to realize, this does not have to fall on the parent. Like, I remember my older brother reading with me, and I actually just learned this yesterday. Um, Frederick Douglass was wanted to learn how to read, and he was a slave, and the woman in the family that enslaved him at first taught him the alphabet, and then her husband said, "No, you can't teach him how to read, stop," and she became even more adamant than her husband about him not learning how to read, and she would be furious when she saw him reading a newspaper. And Frederick Douglass, to his great credit, went out and got little white, he called them urchins, on the street, poor children who didn't have food. They taught him how to read, and he, in exchange, gave them bread because although his owners were not generous with education, they were generous with food. So he traded bread for knowledge. So these little boys taught Frederick Douglass how to read. It can be a babysitter, and being read to encourages a love of reading, but you need someone to sit down and teach your child how to read. And I would say the parents who are doing that actually are the ones who are professional and are working because they're sort of more educated and more aware. Certainly in lower income households, parents are exhausted, and may not have the time to do things, and that's where you see. So what really affects things is economic status, not race, but economic status, not
Okay.
whether.
Okay.
Yeah.
Now, I want you to tell us a story about how you went to school and your son and another friend were, quote, reading a book to each other, or they were to read a book and then tell the story of that book to the partner. And there are no words. Tell us a little bit about that.
Right. So the book that had no words, he brought home from school to read. It was called One Frog Too Many, and he just turned the pages and there were no words. In his classroom, the way reading is taught within balanced literacy, they do something called reading workshop. And again, this is the progressive method of teaching. Children learn to read by reading, right? So they have the children read and the teacher works independently with one or two kids during that period. So I was in the classroom watching this reading workshop and just what a disaster. The teacher retold the story of the little engine that could, and the boys were told, or the children were told, to go back to their tables with their reading partner, read a story, and then tell the story to their partner. Now, how do you retell the story of a story that goes like this? A house is a home. A teepee is a home. An apartment building is a home. Do you know what I mean? Like they're little silly patterns. There is no plot. There is no story. Plus, Eric and his reading partner at that time had no idea how to read. So they were just looking at the pictures. There were words on the pages of the books, but they were just looking at the pictures. And the teacher, I don't know what she thought they were doing, but they certainly were not reading.
And that day you were there, the teacher spent the whole time with two kids, and the rest of the class was doing stuff on their own. And that's supposed to be teaching them how to
Exactly.
read. Yeah.
And COVID exposed that. That was like the big eye opener during COVID because parents all across the country, across the world in English speaking countries could see this. It's like, what are you doing? You're not teaching them. How are you teaching them to read? And realized what was happening. And I think that's why the positive changes that are now happening began to happen. Parents.
It's interesting you said that. You talk about the English the language. It's we're seeing this being taught Australia, New Zealand, Canada, England, America. Yeah, the English speaking countries, the ones that are sometimes doing the worst job teaching our kids how to read. It's fascinating.
Mhm.
And we do such a poor job, and we take it for granted that kids can read and they can't. It's it's difficult, and then they try to do things. I remember what you gave us a story about Mike Bloomberg when he became mayor. He's gonna change things. He's gonna have things that are gonna happen. We're gonna redo how we do things and how we're gonna that turned into a disaster. Also, tell us a little bit about that.
So what happened with that was really an unfortunate sort of honestly lack of knowledge because Bloomberg really meant well. He took office and said he was going to put in traditional phonics into the schools, and he hired a woman named Diana Lamb, who was a big proponent of balanced literacy. And he and the school's chancellor were told that the schools were teaching phonics. And they did have a phonics program in the classroom, but it was very superficial. And Bloomberg and Joel Klein chose to believe the people that they hired. They trusted the people that they hired. It's all a matter of, trust. And 7 of the top reading researchers wrote a letter to Bloomberg saying this is destined to fail because it doesn't have systematic phonics, and they ignored that letter. And Joel Klein, actually, the chancellor, years later said that was his biggest regret, was that he did not
Keep his finger on the pulse and know what's going on.
Right. And he blamed the people that he hired, that they did not inform them enough of this issue and the reading wars and what should have been being taught.
Well, now the reading wars are still going on. As a matter of fact, a very fascinating study came out of Canada, if I'm not mistaken, about their Human Rights Commission up there in Canada. That was a fascinating thing. What did they decide?
So the Human Rights Commission investigated. They launched a public inquiry into why so many children weren't learning how to read. And in 2022, actually, they announced that kids were struggling with reading because Ontario schools were using disproven methods to teach them. And there's been a sea change in Ontario. Many schools in Ontario have gotten their act together. There is a teacher there, her name is Kim Lockhart. She's just a force of nature on Twitter, posting, educating teachers, read this book and do this and go to this seminar. Teachers are using their own salaries to go to conferences to learn how to do this right, because no teacher wants to not teach, right? They were taught improperly, and teachers were also victims in this. But big changes have happened in Ontario, but the challenge now is, the curriculum is changed, but teachers need to be retrained. They need to know how to teach in these methods. And not every school has gotten completely on board. I don't remember the state, but in the US, someone filed a complaint because a school, it's in one of the states where it's against the law to use this method, but a school was still using this method called reading recovery, even though it wasn't supposed to. So that's what I meant about it's against the law, but you have to make sure that the law is being enforced in your school.
And you say there are now 10 states that have banned this look-say or balanced literacy. They've now banned that.
Balanced literacy. It kept renaming itself as people rose up in arms against it. It kept changing its name.
Now, do the teachers have to go back then and get retrained? Do they come to you for assistance?
They are trained by their school districts and by their schools. I have worked in schools training teachers in the science of reading. Very, very eye-opening. Teachers, when they learn about it, I cannot begin to tell you the level of grief that they feel and upset. Someone recently posted online she likened the stages of grief that she went through in learning that she had been teaching incorrectly to the 7 stages of grief you feel when someone dies. Because and teachers have been quoted saying that they just ruined so many children's lives. Certainly without meaning to. They thought they were doing what they were supposed to be doing. So you can imagine how terrible that feels. And I think, what's wonderful and inspiring and eye-opening is how, Twitter has gotten this bad rap for a lot of bad stuff and negative stuff. I haven't seen that. I've been on Twitter for a couple of years now, and the community that has formed on Twitter of teachers and educators helping and supporting and educating each other and sharing resources and posting is absolutely astonishing. And the same with parents groups. Parents of dyslexic children, their children often were taught incorrectly in school, and these parents and mothers fight for other kids' rights. It's so it's such a traumatic experience when it happens. It's like any other trauma. Many people become advocates to help it keep it from happening to other people. That's what's happening now in the world of teachers and in the world of parents. And that was a surprise for me. I didn't know how teachers would react to my book. I thought parents would find it interesting. But there's this like, how do you get parents to read it? Because they don't know it's a problem until it's a problem. Do you know what I mean? But teachers have just absolutely embraced it and said, oh my God, I see myself in that teacher. I see myself doing that. And I'm so glad I'm not doing it anymore. And psychologists have also written reviews saying, wow, I was evaluating children for decades. And when they didn't know their phonics and they didn't have phonemic awareness, which is, recognizing sounds and words, I would label them dyslexic. And I never thought to think maybe they just weren't taught how to do it. Yeah, it's a real big I.
Friends, it's gotten to the point where in California, I know some parents sued a school district, if I'm not mistaken, about their kids not being able to read. What happened in that case?
They won, and same in Michigan. And the money did not go to the children. The money went to the schools to
Right.
help kids with reading, but they won.
Yeah. I think in California it's $10 million, That's being an ex-lawyer, we sort of remember those sorts of things. So that's why that's very fascinating. It's just amazing what's going on, folks. And I have to tell you what, Irene has done a spectacular job with this, educating me, educating everybody about reading. And it's a wonderful book. I really want you to read it. Before we go, what is next? Now, I know you got this book, you got a learning center and other books. Tell us what you're all doing.
So I am working hard getting the word out about the book because I want, books, people are busy, right? And people sit down to read a book because it brings them joy, right? You're not going to want to sit down and read something that's like going to depress you. Maybe an article, okay, but I would just want people to know that the book is a joy to read. People have said it's like a beach read and they can't put it down once they start. It's like a thriller. And you see, the life of a family and it reads like a novel, and woven in with our story is the history of reading instruction, but not in this dry, like way. So I'm trying to get the word out about the book because my goal is really to prevent this from happening to any other family. And I'm rolling up my sleeves. And there's a saying within the field of education that it's better to build fences to prevent problems from happening than be an ambulance and be taking care of, the victims. But I have to tell you, my brother's an emergency room physician, and I think I have ambulance in me too. I have it in my heart to help those children that were hurt. So I'm working at a school in New York now in a third grade classroom where more than 75% of those kids are reading at a kindergarten or first grade level. And one of those children can't even read basic words like cat or, pet. This is a third grader. I want to help her. I'm doing one-on-one work that I find very rewarding because, writing a book is isolating and being there on the ground with my little ambulance is very rewarding.
Folks want to find more about you, Irene. Maybe we can get your books and everything else. Where can they find that? You have a website, if I'm not mistaken.
I have a website. It's called Steps to Reading. So it's stepstoreading.com, and you'll see more about me and my books and the workbooks. I want to mention the workbooks also. There's a video on how to teach children to read, and there's contact information for how to contact me. So Steps to Reading.
Your life changed, my dear, just because the little boy said, why didn't listen to him? Why they're not teaching me to read? You changed your entire life. It's changing our lives because we're learning what we didn't know. And gosh, I'll tell you, you're spectacular, Irene. I thank you so much for spending some time with us today on Books and Looks. So thank you for coming on.
Thank you, Blaine. Thanks.
All right, friends. I don't know if you're like me, but I was shocked when I read that book. And when you hear that interview, what we are doing or not doing with our kids, 2/3 of the kids can't read. 2/3 of our kids can't read in fourth grade. The numbers are horrible. It's absolutely a nightmare what's going on. Some places have banned reading and teaching us reading a certain way. Others, they still do it despite that. Anyway, you want to keep your nose to this and make sure your kids, grandchildren, nieces, nephews, or whatever are reading and learning how to read the right way. Okay. What am I looking at? Well, I'm looking at a historical fiction book we're going to be talking about next week. That's right. It's called The Rhino Keeper. The Rhino Keeper with Julian Forsberg. Now, Julian, this is a first-time book. It's a great book about a gentleman back in the 1700s who bought a baby Indian rhinoceros. That's right. And took him up to the Netherlands and then took care of this rhinoceros. This is some story. It's, like I said, it's historical fiction, mostly historical. Got a little bit of fiction in it, but it's a great story about him and the rhino he calls Clara. So anyway, that's what I'm looking at for next week. You're going to enjoy that one too. So anyway, on behalf of my good friends at Podcast Studio X, this is Blaine DeSantis for Books and Looks, saying may all your leaves be pages in a book.